Welcome everyone who has dialed into the Young Statisticians Writing webinar, which is hosted jointly by the Royal Statistical Society and the Young Statisticians Section. The aim of this event as a whole is to complement the Significance magazine Young Statisticians Writing competition, which is open right now. So we're going to host three great speakers who are with us now, who will tell you everything you need to know to get you started with statistical writing, just any thoughts on science writing and journalism in general. And this is actually the first webinar that the Young Statisticians Section have hosted, so we're really hoping it will be a success. There'll be some options for feedback at the end, so please let us know how it went. My name is Sofia Gorilova, and I'm chairing today's webinar. I'm a government statistician at HMRC currently, and I used to work before that at the Department of Health, and I'm also now on the committee of the Young Statisticians Section of the Royal Statistical Society. As we mentioned earlier, we'll be recording this meeting so we can later post the podcast on the RSS and the YSS websites for anyone else to listen to afterwards, any time they wanted to hear things again. Just to cover our agenda, we have three presentations today which will last about 10 minutes each. I'll introduce each speaker before their talk, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end after all the three presentations are finished. So if you do have any questions, you can ask those at the end. Just to cover the technical details of how you would ask the questions. When the Q&A session is open, you can press star 6 to unmute yourself, although we're having slight issues with the meeting non-meeting, but hopefully we'll unmute everyone and then you'll be able to ask your question. Or you can use the Q&A icon, which is at the top of your screen, top right, where you can type your question on the screen, and then I'll collect all those questions and ask the speakers at the end. I hope everyone can hear us. If you can't, there is a public chat option on the bottom left, so if you are having any technical problems, then type in there and then we can pick that up. Great. I think that's it for all the preliminaries, so we'll kick off with our first speaker, Tarran. Brian is the editor of Significance, a bi-monthly magazine for anyone interested in statistics and the analysis and interpretation of data, which is jointly published by the Royal Statistical Society and the American Statistical Association. Before joining Significance in 2014, he was launch editor for the Market Research Society's award-winning quarterly magazine, Impact. Brian's talk will be about all the details of the competition, including its purpose, as well as any general tips on what the judges will actually be looking for. Yes, I think that's it, and over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Sophia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for all for dialing in today to listen to our webinar on the writing competition. It's an exciting moment for me to be doing this again. This was one of the first jobs I had to do. I joined the magazine last year, and as far as first jobs go, getting to go the interesting entries from Young Statisticians was a great place for me to start. So I want to go through the why, the what, and the how of the competition. Hopefully, give you everything you need to do to submit an entry before our end of May deadline. So I want to start by talking to you a little bit about what significance is. I think, I hope most of you will already know seen a copy or read the magazine regularly. But significance is essentially a showcase for statistics and the role it plays in life, in science, and in commerce. Our articles, I think you could probably sort of drill them down to three core areas. You know, we've got people who write to bust apart myths. They like to difficult questions that society faces, and they like to show how statistics can support decision makers in taking the decisions that they need to take. The magazine's written by statisticians, primarily for statisticians, but the aim to appeal to a broad audience of people. So that can include A-level students who are thinking about pursuing a statistics degree, people who are working in industry who deal with data and analytics and want to know more about it, could be data journalists or data designers, scientists, and of course, professional statisticians who are members of the Royal Statistical Society and the American Statistical Association. So, to reach the broad audience that we aspire to, we need people who are enthusiastic about statistics, and they want to tell the world about their chosen specialism and the contribution it makes. We also need strong writers, people who are able to take the complexities of statistical analysis and boil it down to a simple, straightforward narrative that can people of varying levels of expertise. And we need telling storytellers, frankly. We need to capture people's attention and have articles that take people along with them and entertain in equal measure. So to find these people, we teamed up with the Young Statisticians Section of the Royal Statistical Society to launch the Young Statisticians Writing Competition. The competition was launched in 2011, and we had our first winner published in 2012. The winning articles are published online and in print, and last year's winner, Jonathan, who you hear from later, his article appeared in our feed and in our within our archive for anybody that wants to dig it. We also feature, as of last year, we featured runners-up. We had so many good entries last year, we didn't want to just keep it to one. We wanted to showcase some of the other talent that we'd found through the competition. So if you're thinking about entering the competition, you're probably wondering what's in it for us. Well, we think we get a great talented young writer, and hopefully, the relationship with these writers and that relationship will last throughout this and generate excellent content. And it for you is probably more important to you. So we offer exposure to our international readership of professional statisticians, and we have a global reach from the US, UK, Japan, and other parts of Europe. We also can offer, well, we can't guarantee it, but we've had a lot of success in the past couple of years, and that our winning entries have received coverage in mainstream media. The last year's winner, he had his work covered in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Daily Mail, Newsweek, and China. So it made quite an impact. And of course, you also get the chance to present at the 2015 RSS International Conference, which is being held in September this year in Exeter. We have a special session there where the three finalists can present to the audience, and then after the presentation, the winner is announced, and then the article is published in the October issue of the magazine. So what is it we're looking for exactly? We want 1,500 to 2,500 words on any subject you like, really, and I can't stress that enough. It can be on any subject, as long as it involves statistics and or statistical analysis. We want an easy-to-read magazine-style feature. We're not looking for journal papers, so the structure of the submission would need to reflect that. That also means that in terms of what you put into the article, we like to keep technical terms and mathematics to a bare minimum, and where they are used, if they have to be used, that we like them to be suitably explained so the concepts are easy to understand, if not technical details. The submission should also be an original article that isn't under consideration for publication elsewhere. However, I should say we do welcome submissions that are based on work that's appeared in theses or in papers that have been submitted to or accepted for publication by academic journals, provided that the two articles are sufficiently different. Now, if you follow the link on the slide there to significancemagazine.com/writingcomp, you'll see the full set of competition rules. So this is the big question, I think, that maybe a lot of you are thinking about now, is how do you decide on a topic? I think it's quite a hard thing for me to answer for you, obviously. You'll have to have a think about that. I can recommend go to our website. We opened up our archive, 10 years worth of significance content. It's now open access for anyone to read. That will give you a sense of the kind of articles our audience are interested in and that we like to publish. So that should hopefully help you narrow it down. But I want you to remember, as I said earlier, you can write about anything that you want to write about. So, just a little recap of the past few winners. So Jonathan wrote a piece about whether the population of rats in New York City was really one rat per person. The winner the year before that showed how you could use probability distribution to plan out a wedding guest list. And another of our runners-up last year, we had a piece where he analysed Google search data to see whether Christmas and Christmas-related terms came up earlier in the year to answer whether Christmas really does come earlier each year. So I think the question that you may mostly need to ask yourself is, what is the best way to showcase the power of statistics? And to go back to what I said in one of my opening slides, there are three core areas that we certainly look at, we certainly publish. So that's busting apart a popular myth like Jonathan did with his rats article. Answer a burning question that, it could be a question that comes up in your day job. It could be a question that's debated endlessly in the media, or it could be a question you and your friends chat about at home, down the pub, wherever it might be, where statistical analysis can help provide some semblance of an answer to. And, of course, there's providing evidence to support decision-making. Another one of our runners-up last year, Katie Saunders, she showed how ethnicity data collected by the NHS differs from self-reported ethnicity data, and obviously that has a huge impact on the decisions that the National Health Service has to take. I think the most important piece of advice I can offer you is to make sure it's a topic you're interested in personally and professionally, because I think interest and enthusiasm for a topic comes through in your writing, and if you're not interested in what you're writing about, I think it's fair to say your audience definitely won't be. How do we pick a winner? We have a judging panel. That includes significant editors, myself and Oz Flanagan, who's our website editor. We also have an editorial board. A couple of representatives of that editorial board will sit on the judging panel. And then we have members of the YSS committee. We get together in early June to read the articles, debate the entries, we come up with a short list, announce our finalists, and then we send the winners off to the RSS International Conference where the winners are announced. What are we looking for in particular? We want interesting, engaging and easy to read articles, a strong story married to sound statistics and fault-free analysis. Now, I'm not a statistician myself. Our editorial board and the YSS committee members are, so they'll be paying particular attention to the quality of the statistics in the submission. We want to make sure we're promoting excellent statistical-based stories. We don't want things that are potentially. Jonathan might have some experience, but can talk to you about some of the experience he had with the Wall Street Journal, which features his work in the numbers column, and that they essentially were looking to pick apart the work, but Jonathan was able to defend the work that he did, and the conclusion was that it was a great piece of analysis. So, as I said many times, the winner was announced at the 2015 RSS International Conference. So I want to wish you the best of luck in the competition if you do decide to enter, and open the floor to any questions you might have.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks. Just to confirm, we'll have all the questions at the end, just so we can.
Oh right, sorry. Okay.
Kind of sort of. I think with the mute and unmute, might have a few issues if we do it after every presentation. So. Yeah, just to remind everyone, if you do have any questions, you can type them now if you click on the Q&A icon at the top right-hand side of the screen, or you can ask a question at the end of all the three presentations. So yeah, thanks, Brian. That was really interesting. I actually last year I almost applied, so I'm taking a lot from this, if nothing else. Next up is Jonathan Auerbach. He's been mentioned already. He is the last year's competition winner. Jonathan is a PhD student in the statistics department at Columbia University. Previously, he was a research associate at the Center for Urban Research in the City University of New York. His interests include urban politics, public policy, and statistical methodology. I have to get his slides up. Jonathan is going to tell you all about his experience in writing the article and his perspective on how he came up with the idea and the approach he took to writing it. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sophia. Can everyone hear me?
I certainly can.
Okay, great. I guess. All right, so I'm excited to talk to you today about my experience entering the Young Statisticians Writing Competition. I realize I'm the one with the accent this time, so I'll try to speak slowly. So again, my name is Jonathan Auerbach, and my entry was on estimating the size of New York City's rat population. So prior to my piece, many believed New York City was home to 8 million rats. While I think a lot of people recognize the estimate had little basis in reality, the media and various government workers cited it frequently to convey the urgency of the city's rodent problem. My entry used a public data set of service requests, which are essentially complaints from residents, to argue that the true population of rats is much smaller than 8 million. I motivated the classic capture-recapture method for population estimation taught in many introductory statistics classes, and I demonstrated how a few reasonable assumptions could be used to make the problem of estimating the city's rat population tractable. So first I'm going to talk about writing the article. The idea for the article originated from a project I had worked on a few months earlier, evaluating New York City's open data law for a hearing with the city's legislature. As part of the evaluation, I worked with advocates to gauge whether the data released by agencies actually addressed the concerns of the city's communities. Among health code violations, rats were identified as a top concern. For a variety of reasons, agencies are extremely reluctant to document and share much of their data. Most meaningful insight into many government operations comes from service request data. The problem with this data is that residents complain for a variety of reasons, and the relationship between community need and service request is confounded by an array of social, economic, and demographic factors. When I heard about the competition last March, I wanted to use the service request dataset to write about sampling bias and highlight the problems with using these requests to evaluate agency performance, mostly out of my own frustration with the project I'd worked on earlier. My working title was something like, "When a citizen calls, how should we answer?" And myth-busting was not my intent. In choosing a topic, I settled on rats primarily because they had been identified as a top concern, but also because they aren't as politically sensitive as, say, crime or education. I originally planned on comparing the service request data with data from surveys and inspections by the Department of Health to demonstrate the service request bias. I quickly realized that all of these data sets were unrepresentative of the problem in one way or another. It occurred to me that just estimating the population of rats, or the problem in general, was itself non-trivial and quite interesting. And then I picked the capture, and stratification because I felt those tools were simple enough to explain to an audience of lay people, and chose the myth-busting approach because I thought it was appealing. At the time I was submitting my entry, I remember questioning my topic choice. I asked a few colleagues what they thought about the topic, and the reaction was mixed. Someone asked me, "What did the previous winner write about?" And I said, "Weddings." I remember she said, "Well, why would anyone want to read about rats when they could read about weddings?" I'll also mention that while the statistics was simple, my entry did require a fair amount of data manipulation. I used several different shapefiles to reconcile the article with disparate data sources. I also did a decent amount of research. I read a book on rats by journalist Robert Sullivan, and I also spoke with members of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and the department was extremely helpful. So I'll talk a little bit now about presenting. A month later, I was invited to present my entry at a session of the Royal Statistical Society's International Conference in Sheffield. My presentation was pretty straightforward. I mostly ran through the visualizations I had made for my paper. The only real difference was that I was able to go more in depth. While writing the article, I was worried about losing the reader. I tried to make sure each paragraph followed logically from the previous one. I also used the simplest motivation I could think of for each section, which limited the types of things I could write about. In the presentation, I was able to motivate more complicated ideas. For example, I talked about the importance of accurate figures in policymaking and the role of statistics and open data in promoting transparency and accountability. So now on the response. After the article was published in Significance around October, someone from the Brian Lehrer talk show emailed me, his TV show. They had set Google alerts on various New York City topics and invited me to talk about the article on his show. That was a great experience because the staff had a lot of policy expertise and asked interesting questions about my findings and the role they played in policy. So we talked about the role of statistics in government and open data, government transparency, and accountability. About a week or two later, the LA Times emailed me about writing a story. And then after that story broke, I got flooded with emails. I did an interview on NPR's All Things Considered. I spoke with journalists from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, and many other news outlets. The following 2 weeks were pretty chaotic, but overall it was a lot of fun. I'll say that even though I had some expertise with a press office from a previous job, I was shocked by the diversity of statistical competence. Journalists from some papers were incredibly professional and knowledgeable, while others were remarkably ignorant of basic statistics. And it wasn't the media outlets you would expect. I also got the sense that journalists were pressured to add their own angle in order to differentiate their reporting from other journalists. More than a few tried to find a more complicated angle beyond the story of data being used to challenge a common myth. Since the appearance of my article, I haven't seen the 8 million number quoted at all. I'd like to feel I had some sort of an impact. Of course, the article came out in October, and rats aren't really an issue in the winter. So I'll cap up with a little about the lessons I learned. Hopefully, some of them will be helpful to you. So the first lesson I learned was I thought it was important to start by casting a wide net. So I considered multiple problems and topics that were closely linked together until I got a feel for what would make a good article. So in my case, I just thought about open data transparency and shaping policy, and then ultimately settled on the rats problem. Second lesson was try multiple angles. So even once you pick your topic, you never know what people will find interesting. And I found that when I knew a subject really well and was passionate about it, the angle that I found interesting was generally too complicated for the layperson. And it was generally the types of angles that I thought were a little too simplistic to actually played out much better. The third lesson I learned was consider reaching out to experts. All the experts I talked to were extremely helpful, just to bounce ideas off of or explain what I did and hear what they had to say. And then the last lesson I learned, the hard way, was that transit in Britain is really expensive, and I booked all my tickets last minute, which is a very bad decision. So that's all I have. Great.
Jonathan, that's brilliant. I'm actually amazed by just how much sort of publicity and how much pick up from the media there's been from that competition. So it sounds like a really good experience to have and worth applying for to experience that later. Next up is our third and last presentation by Robert Matthews. Robert is an award-winning journalist and a science consultant for BBC Focus magazine. Originally, he trained as a physicist, but then his journalistic career includes 15 years as science correspondent of the Sunday Telegraph and writing for a wide range of publications from The Times, The Financial Times, The New Scientist to a Spectator and Reader's Digest. He's also a visiting reader in science at Aston University, where his research interests include statistical inference and the mathematics of gambling. Right, and let's get his slides up. Perfect. So Robert will finish off with some general pointers about how to explain complex scientific and technical details in an accessible and engaging way. Thanks, Robert.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. And good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to be dealing with here is obviously a huge subject, but also one I've had to wrestle with for the last 30-odd years of writing about maths and science. And so I've tried to distill into a few slides some pointers to how to go about the actual mechanics of writing a piece, which I hope that you'll find useful. So you've got your subject. using the sort of criteria that Brian talked about. Now you're facing the tough bit, which is actually getting started. Now, this doesn't mean sort of getting started on the research. You've done all that, and you've got the whole subjects all loaded up in your head. But now you've got the blank sheet of paper, metaphorically. Today it's a winking cursor on a screen, and you've got no words at all, and you've got to get between about 1,500 and 2,500 down. And in my line of business, you have to do it against the deadline as well, and that sort of encourages you to greater effort. So your challenge is principally, and Jonathan has already touched on this, is in a sense to cut through everything you know to be able to come up with an introduction that is going to appeal to somebody who knows nothing and potentially cares less about what what you're interested in. And so you've got to spend a few moments, actually it's typically more than a few moments, it can be, I can spend as much as an hour messing around with various opening paragraphs, trying to get something that works. So you have to do the crucial act that anyone who really succeeds in writing has to be able to practice and to master to some extent, and that is the ability to put yourself in the shoes of other people, the reader. Now, amazing as it may seem, there's actually a part of the prefrontal cortex of the brain that humans have got that actually activates when we're doing this. So, for example, if we hear somebody tell a joke, stand-up comedian say, I was coming here today to the O2 Stadium and I couldn't find my way and I got in an awful panic. And instantly, everybody's head, if they were putting brain scanners, and this has been done, everybody's head starts to show activity in this part of the brain that activates when we're putting ourselves in the shoes of other people. People with Asperger's don't have this ability, but with practice we can all get better at it. And so what we've got to do is we've got to be the reader for a moment and try and think what is going to engage them. Now, over the years, I've found some ways into sort of distilling this process, which can sort of speed the process up. So the first sort of generic way to get people in to a story is by using mental imagery. It's something that they can picture and they can all relate to. So, for example, maybe you're doing a piece on applications of Markov chain theory in queuing, trying to make that interesting. You know a lot about it. Technically it's got a demanding subject. But if you start with, consider a Markov chain, that isn't going to work for most people. But if you start with a quote like, or a sentence like, we've all been there, stuck in the slowest queue in the supermarket, wondering why is it always us that gets stuck in the slowest queue. Instantly, people can relate to that, and you've got their attention, and they're thinking, oh, this is interesting. Somebody is addressing something I'm interested in. So that idea of creating some mental imagery is one way of getting people in. The next one is simply to draw on something, a news story that works particularly well, or something that everybody is familiar with, a real life example of something that's happened. So, for example, if you were going to write a piece about the use of Bayesian methodology for optimal search strategies, probably best not to start with a description of Bayes' theorem. You might want to talk about the problem of trying to find an aircraft somewhere in the Pacific Ocean with very little information. Instantly, people can see how that relates to them. And the third technique is to use a killer fact. People love these things that hopefully they haven't heard before, but they would be very pleased to know about and be able to tell their friends about in a pub. It passes what we call the bar stool test. So, for example, it's a not sufficiently well-known fact that most fund managers who recommend the funds to their clients, 85% of them will end up putting you into a fund which, if you just threw darts at the back of the Wall Street Journal, the listing of all the stocks there, you would actually do better. 85% of these extremely well-paid fund managers put their clients into funds that actually would do worse than throwing a bunch of darts at it at the Wall Street Journal. So those sort of things also draw people in. So don't be depressed if it takes you quite a long time to get started. Like I say, I've been doing this for about 30 odd years, and I still find it difficult. That first opening paragraph or two is really tricky, but it's well worth making the effort, because otherwise people might not get to paragraphs 2 through 25. So once you've drawn the reader in, then you've got to keep them interested. And the way to do that is, surprise, surprise, tell them stories. Journalists are always talking about, yeah, that's a great story. And what they mean by that is something that, again, people can relate to. And again, if you can tell the story of why you picked this project, what attracted you to it, the puzzle, the history behind the issue that you're looking at. Also maybe of how the science that you're going to show, how that developed. Like, for example, I'm thinking of David Spiegelhalter of Cambridge University, very distinguished statistician, great storyteller. He tells the story of how he was able to develop techniques that would spot a future Harold Shipman, the murderous GP, using techniques that were actually developed during the Second World War by a statistician to detect production failures in things like tank production, bullet production. And you can use exactly the same thing to detect when a GP has got rather more deaths happening on his watch than you would expect. Same techniques. It's a great way of relating a technical issue to the public. So once you've got them interested and you're telling the stories, what you've got to do is basically keep going. And one of the best ways to do that with science is to use analogies. So, for example, everybody knows that the probability of winning the jackpot on the lottery is very low, and you can do a little bit of combinatorics to work out the chances of picking the 6 winning balls from the 49 that go into the little spinner, and it comes out at about 14 million, 1 in 14 million, which is pretty hopeless. But it's also pretty hopeless in terms of really sort of capturing the scale of the challenge. So if you can do sort of order of magnitude estimates, like if you estimate that a single grain of sugar is about a millimetre on a size. It's a cube about a millimetre across. And then you think about the average size of a bag of sugar, and then you think, well, that's a kilogram bag of sugar. How many would be in that? Then basically, the challenge of winning the lottery is equivalent to putting your hand into a bag of a 12-kilogram bag of sugar and picking out the one black grain that somebody has cunningly hidden in there somewhere at random and pulling it out in one go. So good luck with that. It isn't going to happen to most people. And it captures it much better than saying it's just 1 in 14 million. The next thing is always try and keep it simple. As soon as the going gets a little bit tough, people start to find other things to do. So jargon, a lot of people say never use jargon. It needs, as Brian says, to be kept to a minimum. And in fact, a little bit is quite good, because a little bit sort of draws the reader into your world, tells them a little bit of something that they might not otherwise have known, may have heard but never really known what it was. If you do that, you've always got to explain it. And if you feel that the explanation is taking more than about a sentence or even less than a part of a sentence, think about creating a special box for it. So you can just put the word C box and direct them to that. And maths, symbols, algebra, integral signs, just forget it. Just don't even think about it. Keep it to an absolute minimum. Anything more complicated than a square root sign is going to put a lot of people off. And Brian's going to hate it because he's got to typeset it. So always keep algebra to a minimum. Sentences, the actual words that you use, keep them short and use what's called the active voice, not what's called the passive voice. So when you're writing a paper, you tend to say, following this preliminary data analysis, it was decided to investigate further. That's the passive voice. There was no people involved. It was done passively. We decided to investigate further sounds much better. Words. Ideally, try and keep them as monosyllabic and colloquial as possible. So instead of saying a technical term like the alternative hypothesis was tested using whatever test you want to do and was not confirmed, and then quoting the p-value, just say, this seems to be just flat wrong. It's colloquial, it's punchy, and it's also a demonstration of the simplest way of making anything simpler to read is once you've written your piece, go back through it and replace all the multisyllabic, and they're typically from post-Norman invasion French, take them out and replace them with what typically they're Anglo-Saxon equivalents. They're shorter, they're punchier. And finally, how to wrap up a piece. That can be tricky. A classic technique, and you'll hear a lot of, you'll read a lot of columnists do this, and you'll hear a lot of columnists, broadcasters who are reading out pieces on the radio do this, and it's called the loop back. So you started your piece with that. We've all been there, stuck in the supermarket queue. And you've been through all this theory and all the rest of it, and then you loop it back to, so next time you're in a supermarket queue, the brain, sort of the reader's brain really appreciates that symmetry of going back, seeing where you've come from. And typically, what happened to the Malaysian Airlines flight 370 may never be known, but, and then you bring up your conclusion. Loop backs work really well. Another good way to wrap it is the look forward, or the call to action. So over the next year, we plan to create a sort of sense of action, that you've learned something that is going to be relevant in the future as well. And or something like, so how can we break the stalemate on this particular controversy? And again, it gives the reader sometimes a view on a controversial subject. And readers like to be able to read something and then benefit from that by being able to show off to their friends just how clever they are by parroting back a fantastic conclusion that you put to them in your significance piece, but they might not attribute it to you. But hey, there has to be a price. And finally, the best advice I can give in preparation for this is read all sorts of different types of science writing and read it critically. See why you particularly liked a piece or why you didn't like a piece. Think about what it was that made it work for you. And then on top of that, try and create your own style by putting that into action. So those are my, that's a sort of distillation of 30 plus years of slaving away over a hot keyboard, and I hope you find it of some use. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much for that. I think there's a lot of useful advice in that, and I have to admit I had to mute my mobile because I was laughing a bit too much and interrupting. Great. Well, that was the last of our presentations, which means that our live question and answer session is now open. There you go, as the slide says. So if you did want to ask a question over the phone, if you press *6 on your keypad, phone, whatever you have, then you should be able to ask the question. let's see if that works, and if not, I'll go to some of our Q&A written questions on the icon, and I've got some others prepared as well. So did anyone want to ask anything from any of our presenters? Okay, we'll see if it is an unmute issue, but there's a couple that came through throughout the talk. For example, this one for Brian and possibly Jonathan from Annie. And the question is, my planned article is about quite a British-centric subject, but the statistical method should be interesting to anyone. How do I write it for an international audience?
My perspective on that would be that I think as long as you set up the article as if you're giving readers an insight into a part of British culture maybe that they weren't aware of before, then you could probably capture the attention that way. I like to think that, generally speaking, we've not had much issues in the past before where articles that have been published about British issues or American issues for that matter have been seen as being too sort of country-centric. I think the readership that we have are fairly international people. They're well-read and they like to read about all different things going on in different parts of the world, so you don't have to try too hard to make it broadly appealing, but as I say, give the sense that you're cueing people in, cueing the reader into an aspect of British life that they hadn't known about before would probably help with the sense of intrigue.
Great. Annie, hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to unmute yourself if you're still on the line. We have another question for Jonathan. How experienced were you in statistical writing before, and what sort of publicity had your previous publications had? So any kind of journal audiences, conferences, that sort of thing. And that question was from Vicky.
I'm sorry, the question's about previous statistical writing I had done?
Yeah, so how experienced you were, and what sort of publicity have your previous publications received before you won the competition?
I'm not sure I completely get the question. I guess my statistical writing before the competition had either been entirely academic or had been confined in maybe like policy briefs or when I worked for the city, we did fiscal impact statements where statistics was a tool but not the goal of the writing. So this was actually a really unique challenge for me in that statistics was featured, but you still had to be, you still couldn't assume that your audience knew much about what you were writing. I don't know how much, I would say other than subject matter expertise, I really don't think previous publications particularly helped in writing.
Mm-hmm.
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think some people have unmuted themselves, so did anyone want to ask a question over the phone?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, hello.
Hi, this is Greg Seeley. First of all, thanks to all three of you for presenting today. It was all really interesting. I just wanted to ask Robert, as well as reading other people's scientific writing, are there any books that are specifically on how to write scientifically that you'd recommend?
In a word, no. I don't think that these books tend to work very well. The ones I've read or tried to read seem to be object lessons in how not to do it. The best advice, I think, is what I said at the end, which is basically to read the type of article that, I mean, you could do much worse than to read Significance, which is full of, some really good examples. But also general science magazines like New Scientist, Scientific American. But the great thing about reading Significance would be that you get a particularly relevant example. You see how far typically you can push the technical side of things. Newspaper articles probably aren't so helpful in that, I've had to write about things like Bayesian inference for newspapers, and you end up being able to say very little about the technical aspects, which is, and you could get away with more of that in the articles for this competition. So I wouldn't bother with these textbooks. I've never come across one that I found particularly helpful.
If I could recommend, this is Brian here. If I could recommend one author worth reading, it's definitely not a science writer, but Eric Schlosser, the American journalist who wrote Fast Food Nation and most recently Command and Control. I think he does a great job of showing how you can talk about quite technical subjects and
right.
get people sold on technical subjects by giving a human interest narrative around that. He does that very well. All of his chapters, if you read all of his chapters in any of his books, they always start with a human perspective, a personal perspective, before going into what is essentially quite dry technical detail.
Yes. I think, yes, maybe I should explain that I took the meaning of the question to be any of the sort of textbooks on how to write about scientific subjects. I don't find those particularly useful. In terms of science writers, then yes, there are a number that I would recommend. I mean, Gary Taubes, American writer who did The Diet Delusion, which I think is probably for my money, the best example of science writing I've ever read in terms of mastery of so much subject matter. I mean, it's colossal. It's about 700 pages. So it's not quite an exemplar of what's required for the competition. But there are definitely some examples of science writing by science authors that would be well worth reading.
He's far too modest to say it as well, but Robert Matthews' work would probably be worth checking as well.
Well, that's very kind, Brian. Checked in the post.
We had a quick question on public chat on how many entries came through, and thanks for last year's writing competition. Thanks for Tim for confirming that there were 22 entries submitted last year. We've also had a question for Jonathan. First of all, to follow up on your previous answer, have you gone on to continue your kind of popular statistical writing? And this question was from Walla.
I'm sorry, the question's on continuing writing after the competition?
Yeah, did you continue write more popular stats articles and for other papers and the like?
It's kind of a funny story. So I'm still in my program, which keeps me pretty busy. If I had more time, I would love to write more things. There's I think a contrast between the types of stuff I would want to write and the type of stuff that I think Significance does really well versus the types of stuff I think outlets want to see mainstream. So there's a lot of outlets that are interested in paying for getting content that nods to statistics, but is much more about visualization and conclusions of data that aren't very scientifically sound. And I would personally want to stay away from those opportunities, despite how large the audience might be. And then, of course, if you want to do something right, so on the other hand, staying away from outlets where maybe it's very easy to write something because you don't have to be very rigorous. If you want to write something for, say, Significance or something where you have to be more rigorous, it takes a lot of time and effort to do something. So I see myself doing it in the future, but right now I just don't have the amount of time that I would want to do a good job.
Mm-hmm. We've actually had a question that's a very good follow-up to that from Tim. What is your view of the quality of the media reporting on your winning piece? Were there any particular ways in which your concerns were misrepresented?
Oh, yeah. A lot of it was misrepresented. A lot of people tried to advocate policy based on the findings. So one of the things that was difficult, specifically, I think, for journalists to understand was the trade-off between simplicity and accuracy. That you could have maybe a more complex model with more rigorous assumptions that's perhaps more accurate, but then you lose something it's less simple, and then possibly performs worse if your assumptions are wrong. It was that type of trade-off that I think that journalists didn't understand, and when I got challenged, they'd say, "Hey, how come you made this assumption or you didn't make this assumption?" Another thing that I think was misunderstood was I was interested in the rat population but I admitted that wasn't necessarily the best metric for determining how to deal with rats. So say there's much fewer than previously thought. If bites are up, attacks are up, asthma attacks are up year over year, does it matter how many rats there are? It's become more of a problem. So I think a lot of journalists try to connect the dots and say, well, it doesn't even matter how many rats there are because it's not, it doesn't represent the problem well. And I never said it did. It was I guess confusion over the importance of the findings, as well as the rigorousness of them as well. And I thought I was doing. I mean, maybe people ended up disagreeing, but I thought I was doing a service by making the topic easy to understand and I kind of highlighting. I think a lot of people didn't realize how important rodents were as a problem, and I think some journalists didn't necessarily think that was a service. So it was a very mixed experience, I'll say.
Yeah. We had a question from Linda in the public chat that I think refers to your paper and a more technical side of which statistical methods did you actually use in the paper?
Which statistical methods? I mean, so I essentially motivated capture capture. And I introduced it, and then I pretty much said, but to the degree we have to change the data in certain ways because the assumptions underlying the method aren't held. Before writing the paper, I actually something I wish I had time to do, and had I realized it would have had to perhaps the ultimate if I knew it was going to be as popular as it ultimately was, I would have tried various other methods, and when I got a phone call from maybe a journalist, I could say, hey, not only do my results say this, but when we try these more sophisticated methods, we also get similar results. But I think by the time I realized that people found this topic interesting, I was already so busy with coursework and whatnot that I didn't have a chance to do that. So the methods in the paper are relatively simple, and I think maybe at some point I'll go back and try to use more complex methods, deal with heterogeneous call rates or some of the spatial patterns more rigorously.
Yeah, that's great. I think I'd be keen to read that for sure once the PhD is over.
Maybe.
Did anyone... Go on, sorry.
Oh, I said maybe.
Okay. Did anyone else want to ask a question over the phone at all? No? Okay. I've got a few more stored up for you guys. There's one for Brian. You mentioned, I think you've kind of touched on the differences of a magazine style feature and the scientific paper, but could you explain further what the exact differences are between kind of this piece here for magazine and decoding normal statistical writing or scientific writing that we would submit academically?
Yeah, of course. I think Robert will probably have some interesting perspective on this as well. But the way I see it, I mean, a lot of articles do come to us in a academic paper form, and these tend to, they start with the conclusions essentially, and then work backwards through all the detail until you sort of reach the end point, of what next. But for a magazine article, I mean, I understand why journal papers are structured in that way, but for a magazine article, that doesn't really work in that you want to be hooking people into the story that you're going to tell, and that you want to be not presenting them with a big whole section that is all about the method and all about the detail, but you want to be weaving that detail and method throughout the story that you're telling, and essentially building up to something, building up tension or interest or excitement or whatever it might be before you deliver your conclusion, to give them something, to leave them with something memorable. I think that would be the difference as I see it. The only thing I can really recommend is picking up magazines and just putting them side by side with a journal paper that you might be looking at already, and comparing the difference between the two and the style that the two take. I mean, they are very different, and I think we see enough published features articles nowadays. All of us read enough of it online and in blogs and things. All the difference. It's just about training yourself to write in that way, thinking about structure.
We have an interesting question for you, Brian, about whether you, for significance articles, whether you try to get into statistics, or do you try not to in these articles in order to keep a layman perspective?
So can you say again?
Yeah, so for articles published in significance, do you aim to focus on the stats, or do you aim to kind of step away from the complexity in order to keep that kind of easy to read, simple perspective? Or is there a kind of, where's the balance?
I think we have to have a comfortable mix, because we're in a situation where our readers, the bulk of our 25,000 readers, are professional statisticians, either early on in their career or far into their career, and they expect a certain level of detail and interest for them in their article. But at the same time, Significance is a magazine; it's not a journal. We're trying to reach a broad audience. So I think the path we try to tread is to keep the main story, the main narrative of the article, as straightforward and as simple as possible, so that pretty much anybody, if they have an interest in science or in data-related topics, they can follow what's being talked about and what's being done, and they grasp the concept of what is being written about. And then, as Robert mentioned in his presentation, we make use of boxes to explain concepts or to focus on the details. So if somebody wants to understand a bit more about the method behind what was written about, then they can dig into that. So it's there for them if they want it, but not so that it gets in the way of anybody that might not want to read that level of detail.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Well, we do still have some questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. But we do, you can send me your feedback, and if there are questions, I can pass them on to the speakers. Robert's slides have got his email address on it. If you've got more questions about the writing competition in particular, if you go on the RSS or the YSS website, all the details are on there. There is an email address where you can ask any further questions. Do provide any feedback if you like, either to my email address, or at the top there is a poll button. You can click on that and provide your feedback that way. Thank you again so much for our three speakers and for the interesting subjects that they've covered, and also thank you to everyone that has dialed in. As I said, this is our first ever webinar, so it's really nice to see people engaging with it, and hopefully we can put on a few more going forward. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Thank you very much. And watch out on our two websites and all our social media for any more news of webinars or any other things that the Young Statisticians Section or the Royal Statistical Society or the American Statistical Association are getting up to.